Elizabethans, when they went to bed at night, they would say their prayers, and they all prayed for one thing: nasal congestion. And so, hopefully, at the end of this presentation, you'll kind of understand why. This is to give you an overview of the sanitary conditions that were, and personal hygiene practices that existed in Elizabethan London. What I found is personal hygiene, no surprise, is a very different experience from what we have now. I'm going to give you a brief preview of bathing and sanitation, general living conditions in London, dealing with bodily functions, bathing and grooming, and finally covering the stink, which will make sense at the end. And I tried to scatter some appropriate quotes throughout. Okay, so a very brief history of bathing and sanitation. It seems that the whole sanitation thing was very non-linear. I found archaeological evidence that is well below, like 5,000 BC, where they actually had baths and toilets. I have some pictures. So the Romans, the Egyptians, Polynesians, they all really valued cleanliness. The Romans had kind of made bathing an art form. They would take at least one bath a day and possibly more, and it was very involved, and I don't have time to go into all of that. But what happened is the early Christians noticed that there was this decline into promiscuity and sexuality and also the spread of disease, and they kind of quashed the whole idea, and then of course the Roman Empire kind of collapsed anyway. These are some pictures I was able to scour the net for, and these were all bathtubs. This is the oldest known bathtub, the one in the lower left corner. It's known as the Queen's Tub, and I thought that was pretty fascinating, and the plumbing up at the top. So what happened is, and actually, I don't remember if I had a slide or not, the early Crusaders brought the idea of public baths back to England, but, well, actually I'm skipping ahead of myself. So as late as 1843, it was illegal to bathe between November 1st and March 30th. And that's a carryover. The Puritans brought all of their ideas about sanitation and bathing with them when they came here. And those were actually my ancestors. But in Boston, it was banned unless you had doctor's orders. And this guy, W.T. Sedgwick, wrote a textbook, and they were starting to figure out, okay, this is spread, cleanliness stops the disease. But it was still, he wrote that it was an acquired taste. It was really interesting.
Oh, I like your quote at the bottom.
So here's some early toilets. The one at the top with the Sri Lanka is really interesting. That was actually in a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, and it's one of the more ornate ones. And they were talking about how they had it tilted just so, and it was kind of fascinating. But oh, and one other thing, right here. I don't know if you see it, there's like this channel. This would have water flowing through it. And so what they would do is they had sticks with a sea sponge on the end of it. And when they were finished doing their thing, they would dip the sponge in the water. And the groove in the front was actually so you could get the stick down there to clean, which was kind of intriguing. Pretty smart. Guys, and these were really old. I don't remember the dates for them. So, okay, so living conditions in London. Houses were really, really close together, sometimes even, attached. It was smelly. You had all kinds of, the slaughterhouses, the poulters, the tanners, the fishmongers. The streets were crowded with people, and not only people, but animals. They had cart horses and oxen. There were scavenger animals. There were cats and dogs. There were pigs and rats. The black rats, not the brown rats, which I'll get into later. And all of those kind of, added to the feces and urine that were on the streets, as well as the mud. Big streets usually had two gutters called the sewers, which actually incidentally means seaward. And so that's kind of how you have it on the streets. Disease was rampant. People were frequently ill, which is no surprise when you here more. The rivers were considered pretty much by everybody a place to dump stuff. And it got so bad with like the offal from the slaughterhouses and whatnot that they actually had laws that you had to wait until the ebbing tide would go out, and you would have to go, boat it to the middle, dump it, and so that it would be carried out to the sea.
It's still kind of smelly there.
What's that?
It's still kind of smelly there.
Yeah.
In Europe? No, seriously.
Yeah, I
Paris
can
is
imagine.
Paris is smelly.
So all of the rivers inside the walls, because apparently there were channels that went through London, they were all polluted. People were really, really crowded. There was I heard conflicting, or I read conflicting statistics. One source said 120,000 people to 200,000 people. Another source said 500,000. Doesn't matter. It was a lot of people close together. They needed water. What they did was they brought conduits out, conduits from outside the city in, and it went into fountains. Most of those pipes were lead, which is, I'm amazed anybody survived with their body and brains intact. I really. So the poor ended up getting their water from fountains. And there was actually, there was also some political stuff with where the conduits were being built and everything, but I don't have to deal with that either. There was an effort to keep businessmen from channeling the water to businesses, but the water could actually be pumped to the houses and to wealthy houses and the hospital, St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And there was an account of a woman, and it's a little bit after the time period, but she was getting her water through a quill, and it was about 3 gallons an hour. And that was considered a good flow. So. Okay, and when it translated funny from Keynote to PowerPoint, so I apologize. Vermin were a constant annoyance, and fleas and bugs bugged everybody, pun intended.
That's very cute.
Rushes, in a typical home, rushes would be laid down on the floor, and they would be sprinkled with herbs to smell nicer, and not every floor, like not the bedrooms, but the eating area usually. I'm sorry, what?
What are rushes?
It's a type of grass. It's kind of thick, and so you would go down to the marshy area.
It's like palm trees.
Yeah. So large dwellings could have, like for nobility and whatnot, could house 60 servants. The castle reportedly had 1,500, which I find hard to believe. So can you imagine 1,500 people in one castle, especially in the summer times? After a couple months, it gets really rank. So what would happen is the court would go on progresses to some lucky nobility who would be able to feed and house all of these people, and then have to clean up after as well. So it was really expensive. But yet the servants would stay behind, and they would clean out the castle and restock and everything. Queen Elizabeth made great use of her progresses because it would, she'd get out, get to see who was what, but it also saved her a ton of money. Okay, so moving on into bodily fluids. Yes?
Can I pick one?
Oh, sure.
I can't relate.
I'm sorry.
I think I just said the other one.
Okay. So, do you need to see the...
Oh, I can see it exists. Okay.
We heard why.
All right, so people were much closer to bodily functions than we are now. It was pretty matter of fact, and I'll be talking about a little bit more. But I found this quote in a journal where it talks about this man was surprised that their servants basically followed their lords around all day, bareheaded and everything. But then if the lord stopped to urinate, he stood there, and he says it's more surprising that they also just stood there bareheaded if their horse urinated, which means that they had to take a hat off because almost everybody wore a hat. And it's kind of like, okay, I'm taking the hat off because the horse is urinating. it's kind of weird. This is the lower 2 quotes were from a book. There were a ton. Once I finally got my research going, I found so many old books and manuals and how-to books for manners and raising children and everything. It's really fascinating. So it's in play to greet somebody who is urinating.